Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're setting the scene at the very crossroads of empires. We're going to take a massive, almost cinematic journey tracing an incredible 80-year arc of history. We're going from the calm, sepia-toned era of Victorian steamships arriving in the Mediterranean all the way to the vibrant, turbulent Technicolor of the 1950s. We are looking at the British Empire in Cyprus. Okay, let's dive right into this with a really fascinating question. How did the British actually acquire Cyprus in 1878? Was it a grand military invasion? Well, the bizarre reality is that it wasn't an invasion at all. The British essentially just rented it. Through a completely secret agreement, the administration of the island was handed over to Britain, while sovereignty officially remained with the Ottoman Empire. Now, what's truly mind-blowing is the exact price tag of that so-called rent. The British agreed to an annual payment of precisely £92,799, 11 shillings and 3 pence. This became known as the Cyprus tribute. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. This money didn't actually go to the Ottoman Sultan. It was extracted directly from the impoverished local Cypriot population through incredibly heavy taxes, and the British secretly diverted those funds straight to the Bank of England to pay off defaulted Ottoman loans from the Crimean War. So it was a massive financial burden forced on the locals right out of the gate. So here is our roadmap for today. Number 1, renting the island. Number 2, the Victorian physical imprint. Number 3, the government railway. 4, cultural clashes in the classroom. And finally, number 5, the struggle for independence. Section 1, renting an island. The 1878 Cyprus Convention. So, to protect the Suez Canal from a growing Russian threat, Britain promised to protect the weakening Ottoman Empire in exchange for administering Cyprus. This created a highly confusing legal status that evolved over decades. From 1878, it was technically Ottoman but British-run. Then jump to 1914, when the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers in World War I, Britain officially voided the lease and just annexed the island. By 1925, following the Treaty of Lausanne, where Turkey renounced its claims, Britain finally formalized the whole shebang by declaring Cyprus a full British Crown colony. Section 2, the Victorian physical imprint, architecture of an empire. When the very first High Commissioner, Sir Garnet Wolseley, arrived, he brought the full, unmistakable aesthetic of the British Empire with him. We're talking officials stepping off steamships in pristine white linen suits projecting naval dominance, along with those iconic cork pith helmets. They established a centralized bureaucracy, and the Public Works Department quickly got to work modernizing the island. Today, it's estimated that there are still over 700 surviving British colonial buildings scattered across Cyprus. But rather than just importing British brick, they adapted to the Mediterranean climate. They used local yellow sandstone and adopted local architectural traditions to create this really unique fusion. The ultimate symbol of this architectural fusion is the current presidential palace. Built in the 1930s to replace the original wooden government house, it is literally an architectural cocktail. Designed by Maurice Webb and a few others, it took arcades from an 18th century monastery, added a tower mimicking the medieval Colossus castle, incorporated Byzantine and Ottoman domes, and then, to top it all off, stamped a massive British royal coat of arms right above the main entrance. It was a very deliberate attempt to project imperial permanence while simultaneously mimicking the island's deep, deep heritage. Now, to escape the blistering summer heat of the plains, the administration built the Troodos Hill Station high up in the mountains. Modeled after the famous hill stations of British India, Troodos essentially became the Simla of Cyprus. Up here, isolated from the native population, British officials completely recreated rural English life. They built these cottages out of local igneous rock with French tiles, they played croquet and tennis, and they maintained incredibly strict Victorian etiquette, basically ruling the island from the cool pine-scented peaks. Section 3, the Cyprus Government Railway, connecting the colony. If architecture was the visual symbol of the empire, infrastructure was its physical pulse. Starting in 1905, a 76-mile narrow-gauge railway was built in 3 main sections to completely transform the colony's connectivity. It started at the newly modernized port of Famagusta, stretched 36 miles across the central plain to the capital Nicosia, and eventually reached the western mining regions of Morphu and Avrichu by 1915. And in a true, slightly shocking display of colonial pragmatism, the track foundations out in the plains were sometimes reinforced using stones taken directly from ancient local ruins. Initially, locals viewed these trains as just a bizarre spectacle, but it really quickly evolved into a vital imperial artery. Just consider the incredibly diverse cargo it carried. You had timber coming down from the Troodos Mountains, massive amounts of copper and ore for the Cyprus Mines Corporation, an international mail arriving by sea from Egypt. During the World Wars, it transported Allied troops, and later, between 1946 and 1949, it was even used to transport thousands of Jewish refugees to internment camps.
Section 4. Classrooms and Cultural Clashes, the Psychological Imprint.
So the administration relied heavily on a framework of divide and rule. From the very first census, the British categorized the population rigidly into ethnic groups, Greek and Turkish, rather than just religious ones, which deeply shaped the island's entire psychological landscape. The British eventually tried to centralize education to create a loyal colony. They introduced English as the medium of instruction and literally banned Greek flags and the teaching of local history. But, as you might guess, this sparked an intense ideological tug-of-war. In reaction, segregated schools became deeply entrenched in their own ethno-nationalism. They looked toward Greece for enosis, or union, and toward Turkey for modern Kemalist nationalism.
This rigid, bureaucratic reality completely backfired on the administration. Instead of making the youth more British, the attempt to de-Hellenize the curriculum ended up turning secondary schools into the ultimate centers of reaction and resistance against colonial rule. And looking at these administrative records, you can see the growing intercommunal alienation. Remember that price tag metaphor we talked about at the beginning? Well, those heavy Cyprus tribute taxes, combined with a total lack of democratic representation and unfulfilled promises of self-rule, brewed incredibly deep resentment across the decades. The pot was just slowly, steadily coming to a boil.
Section 5. The Struggle for Independence. Sepia Fades to Technicolor. This quote from our sources frames it absolutely perfectly, the language of the unheard. In 1931, tensions over those taxes and the education policies erupted in a revolt where the original wooden government house was burned completely to the ground. Because the colonial administration failed to address the underlying political aspirations of the local populations, that 1931 spark directly evolved into the fierce armed struggles of the 1950s, making intercommunal alienation almost inevitable.
And this is where our visual metaphor completely shifts. The calm, sepia-toned Victorian era shatters into the chaotic Technicolor reality of the 1950s. The slow-moving Cyprus government railway just couldn't compete with improved road networks, and the sudden rise of vintage cars, finally closing down on New Year's Eve 1951. And just as the physical landscape modernized, the political landscape exploded. The peaceful, rented rule of the past was shattered by the EOKA armed struggle for enosis, plunging the island into a fierce intercommunal conflict leading up to independence in 1960.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative question to ponder today. How does an 80-year rented rule, a geopolitical lease that brought railways, imposed strict schooling, and utilized a divide-and-rule administration, still shape the deeply complex and divided map of the Mediterranean we see today? The British Empire may have left Cyprus, but its architectural, infrastructural, and psychological blueprints are still woven into the very fabric of the island. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this sparked your curiosity to go learn more about this fascinating slice of history.